Following on from the last two videos, I mean to take a look at the concept of the Great Triad in ancient Greek and perennialist thought, and to contrast it with the orthodox conception of the Trinity. There is of course no equivalence between these two, as René Guénon observes in his short book on the Great Triad, but the ways in which they may be related to one another will be insightful, I think. To begin with, let us recap what St. Gregory of Nyssa had to say about the concept of hypostasis or personhood, which is essential in understanding the unity and multiplicity of the Christian Trinity. As he wrote in his On the Creation of Man, "It is the notion of hypostases that accords to each separation by means of the properties that are seen in them, and this also appears in number as a composition. Nature, however, is one, unified with itself and a precisely undivided monad, not increased through addition nor decreased through subtraction, but in what it is one, and remains one even though it appears in a multitude. It is indivisible, continuous, and complete, and not divided alongside the particulars that participate in it. And just as a people, a community, an army, and an assembly is always said in the singular, but each is known in the plural, so according to the more precise formula, man is properly said as one, even though those who are shown in the same nature are a multitude." St. Gregory's view of number in this passage seems to express a quantitative view. This we may contrast in some part with the Great Triad, which relates to number and sacred geometry in a qualitative sense. This distinction between quality and quantity may require some unpacking. To take an example of the opposition between qualitative and quantitative aspects of identity, imagine your computer password. If you miss out just one character, the computer rejects the attempt. It fails to recognize the identity of the password because identity, for the computer, is reduced to a quantitative sum of the constituent parts. As a contrasting example, imagine you have an apple. If you take a bite out of the apple, it does not take on an identity other than apple. There is no essence of apple with a bite of X quantity of molecules taken out of it. This kind of nominalism would make knowledge and communication impossible. We couldn't even have a word for apple. Aristotle, thanks to his doctrine of act and potency and that related doctrine of substance and accident, allows for a notion of natural essences, like apples and apple trees, or human beings, etc. The philosopher Plato, by contrast, remains skeptical about the reality of substances as such. Because he preceded Aristotle's ideas of substance and accident, and the perspectives engendered by them, his doctrine of the forms had to reduce reality to the simplest and most indivisible qualities, those aspects of reality which are logically and aesthetically irreducible and irreducibly different to one another. The status of these forms caused Plato some problems, as recounted in his dialogue The Parmenides, and he remained in doubt as to whether there could be forms corresponding to what Aristotle would later describe as natural essences. As he writes, he was not sure whether there could be a form corresponding to mankind, for instance. Nevertheless, both Plato and Aristotle could have agreed upon the fundamental reality of a dyad of oppositions between being and non-being, act and potency, or the one and prime matter. A relatively unknown text of the Neoplatonist Porphyry of Tyre explains his perspective on the Great Triad with great clarity. This is a work titled On Principles and Matter, translated from a Syriac manuscript, the original, which has not survived, presumably being in Greek. Porphyry is particularly relevant because he was one of the first philosophers to attempt a proper synthesis of Plato and Aristotle, and he was also an early critic of Christianity. His observations about the elements reiterate the Platonic notion, from the Timaeus, of the irreducible qualities of our cosmos. But it is known that there is nothing tangible and hard without earth, and also there is nothing visible and hot without fire. Therefore there is something of earth and something of fire in us. There is also something of spirit in us that is contained in the arteries, and a wet nature contained in the veins. And it is evident that there is no wet nature without water, and nothing like spirit appears unless there is air. Therefore there is some part of water, and also a part of air in us. And because those things which are parts are in us, it is also necessary that those parts which are in them are in us. That is, the whole, therefore, is present in all bodies here, fire, water, air, and earth. Further, these bodies are divided into forms and qualities. Fire is divided into heat, brightness, and lightness, and together with them into its shape and aggregation. Further, we divide earth into its dryness and its coldness, and with them also into its stability, its firmness, its fixedness, and its shape. And in the same way we also divide and differentiate in mind those two bodies that are in the middle, I mean air and water, making a distinction between their proper qualities and their distinct shapes. After this we investigate what it is in which these qualities and forms appear to subsist and exist. For we discover that there is something in which they are set, something that is established in order to receive them, while they do not have a basis for their existence in themselves. This thing in which forms and qualities are imprinted and where they are set, we call matter. Thus, by means of this introductory science, it became apparent to us that there is one principle of everything which is called material and matter. He goes on to write, "Now after it has been said what a principle is and what its properties are, it is necessary to inquire whether fire is the first principle from which existing things come to be, or whether it is earth, water, or air. If someone says that one of these elements is a principle, he errs by setting as a principle that which comes to be. Instead, I say that coming to be has a principle from which it comes to be, but a principle is not a coming to be. In that case, when the first principles are reduced to two, it is necessary that they be opposite to each other. For this is also how some people before Plato taught. Some of them stated that principles of existing things are the hot and the cold, while others that they are the wet and the dry. One of them, love and victory. Still others said that it is one and many, or even and odd. This is monad and dyad, as the Pythagoreans said. All of them agreed that the first principles were opposite to each other, although they differed from each other, in that some of them considered them as secondary, some as primary, and some only as material. However, it also seems good to us that, when the first principles are reduced to two, and are thus opposed to each other, one of them is like an active one, and the other is like one that is affected by it. But it is necessary that these principles not originate from something else or from each other, and two of them that are characterized as being in primary opposition, because they are primary, cannot originate from something else, and because they are opposed, they cannot originate from each other. Those opposites in each of them exist in them by accident, in that they are generated things, and consequently they originate from each other, while the primary ones do not. For if they had to come to be or are coming to be, they would no longer be primary in the proper sense. So of two first principles which are opposed to each other, as we said, one is active and the other is passive. The active one is God, and the passive one is matter. And because he is the active cause, it is necessary that he performs his actions in accordance with the idea, form, and thought that are in him. This made apparent to us that there is a third principle of existing things. These are, namely, the three first principles of existing things: God, matter, and the first ideas of existing things. God is the principle by which originally something was acted. The first idea is the principle after the likeness of which something which was acted, and matter is the principle out of which originally some activity acted. Porphyry's triad of God, the first idea, and matter is equivalent to the perennial triad of René Guénon, of God, heaven, and earth, which he also relates to the traditional Chinese triad of heaven, earth, and man, the middle term between the two. This just goes to show how the perennialist philosophy makes matter or passivity a principle co-eternal with God, and thus makes God immanent in and even dependent upon the cosmos. This relationship is not only one of opposition, but of complementarity, such that Porphyry even describes the principle of matter as being like a mother, like a female, and a receptacle of all things like this. As René Guénon observes, as we shall see more fully in due course, the Far Eastern triad belongs to the type of ternary composed of two complementary terms plus a third term resulting from the union, or if it be preferred, the reciprocal action and reaction of the first two. Using as symbols images taken from the human sphere, the three constituents of a ternary of this kind can as a generalization be described as father, mother, and son. Now it is clearly impossible to make these three terms correspond to the three terms of the Christian Trinity. Elsewhere, Guénon helpfully expresses this dyad of God and matter or heaven and earth, in terms of quality and quantity. It is worth noting that Guénon, who very seldom quotes any other Western authors, cites esotericist Antoine Fabre d'Olivet, who had some suspicious links with various figures of the French Revolution, probably through his involvement in Freemasonry. René Schwaller de Lubitz likewise observed that the Great Triad was a commonplace of esotericism in ancient Egypt. As the translators of Schwaller de Lubitz's book, The Temple in Man, write in their foreword, Schwaller de Lubitz explains in Le Temple de l'Homme that in the ancient temple civilization of Egypt, numbers, our most ancient form of symbol, did not simply designate quantities, but instead were considered to be concrete definitions of energetic formative principles of nature. The Egyptians called these energetic principles netas, a word which is conventionally rendered as gods. They then quote the following passage. In considering the esoteric meaning of number, we must avoid the following mistake. 2 is not 1 and 1. It is not a composite. It is the multiplying work. It is the notion of the plus in relation to the minus. It is a new unity. It is sexuality. It is the origin of nature. Phusis, the neta too. It is the culmination, the separating moment of the full moon, for example. It is the line, the stick, movement, the way. Wotan, Odin. The meter, Thoth. Mercury, spirit. Schwaller de Lubitz, like Guénon, was probably influenced by Fabre d'Olivet and the doctrines of Freemasonry, which claimed descent from ancient Egypt. In any case, the main claim was that Pythagoras himself derived his doctrines from Egypt, and whether or not this historical claim holds up, and I think it most likely does, from at least the time of Pythagoras this metaphysical understanding of number and its ramifications enters Greek culture. Worldviews built upon the Great Triad define particular identity through a dialectic of oppositions. This means they lack the orthodox conception of personhood, because in dialectical terms a person is only understood quantitatively, in terms of material individuation, which presupposes the dyad. Yet for orthodox theology, the concept of person actually precedes the dyad, transcending all opposition between act and potency, being and non-being, etc. This concept, I believe, is unique to orthodoxy. As we have seen, St. Gregory of Nyssa associates quantity with number, and in that sense, the Trinity pre-exists number in terms of quantity as such. It is not dependent upon any material or passive principle. Likewise, if we have seen in the videos I did about the essence-energies distinction, St. Gregory does not conflate God's own natural power or dunamis with the principle of passive potency, which constitutes one pole of the classical dyad. Passive potency for the orthodox is not coeval with God. The Great Triad is certainly of value, and it does describe aspects of the created order with insight. This is only, in my view, a kind of technical knowledge, however, and not anything especially profound or spiritual. A recent episode, number 228, of the Courtney Turner podcast gets into this issue, with I think a very incisive take from Jay Dyer on the limits of the kind of knowledge we've been discussing so far.
And it does go all the way back to Egypt. Now, in my view, there's a lot of things that ancient philosophy, and I think that if you read the Timaeus, Plato's Timaeus is a representation of what's in Egyptian theology. I think that what Neoplatonism and all these mystery schools represent, because you'll notice that a lot of the alchemists, a lot of the Renaissance magicians, they're just restating old Neoplatonic models, and they're refitting them. The Sufis do this, the perennialists do this. They just take Neoplatonism and tweak it. Kabbalah is really just tweaked Neoplatonism as well. Mm-hmm. So what that system is, in my view, is not really any good for telling us about God. But I do think that those systems can encode and can contain truths of nature. So they do have the secrets of nature, in my view. And that's when I think a lot of the occulted knowledge of nature and whatnot typically lines up with Neoplatonic models. So I think that's probably what's going on.
This is why, in my mind at least, the esoteric or occult analyses of the Bible, for instance, ring hollow. The moral regeneration and the new life in Christ is not a metaphor for alchemy or some technical knowledge or process. Again, my point is not that there is something wrong with knowledge of nature and science, etc. These are all great things in their proper place. My point here is that alarm bells should ring when we hear the likes of Guénon and other esotericists denigrating the moral message of the Gospels and Christianity as something superficial and exoteric, and praising, by contrast, any and every kind of symbolic allegorization of the faith. I suspect that what this really means is they want to homogenize the religions, and in our own age this is often accompanied by an attempt to reduce faith to a kind of metaphysical science,